Hey, everybody. Welcome to the webcast. I'm Tim Cladds. I'm a reporter and columnist with the Globe and Mail in the business section, and I'm going to be the host and moderator today. So on behalf of the Globe, a few remarks. I'd like to recognize Don Grant Thornton for making today's event possible. We've got a speaker from the company on our program today, along with a few others who are joining us independently. Over the next hour, we're going to talk about how Canadian businesses can stay on solid ground or get back on solid ground in some cases as we weather this challenging economy. So coming up shortly, we've got a panel of restructuring experts and business leaders who will talk about strategies to strengthen your balance sheet and your business or to navigate adversity. That might mean taking the business in a different direction, selling off parts of the company, or embarking on an acquisition, maybe to change things up. As we all know, business restructuring looks different from company to company. And from what we can tell from registrations, we've got a wide kind of diversity of listeners or followers today. So, we know that there's kind of a gamut of options out there, and not everybody is in the same boat. For some, it's going to be a well-timed strategic pivot. For others, sometimes means confronting financial distress and coming to terms with that. And when you do, what does that mean? And what options do you have? But first, our first guest today is going to provide some context on Canada's insolvency system for businesses who might be in distress or perhaps worried that they're approaching it. So let's introduce her. Elizabeth Lang is Canada's Superintendent of Bankruptcy. She's a lawyer by training, and in her current role, she focuses on supporting businesses, investors, and consumer confidence in the Canadian marketplace. So welcome, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, as we'll hear a little later on, many businesses embark on restructuring or strengthening initiatives while remaining on very solid financial footing. Others may find themselves insolvent or at a point where they need to declare bankruptcy. We thought it might be helpful for those who may not know you and your office to provide some information on Canada's framework for all of this, given that it's often a new experience for business leaders. So tell us a bit briefly about your office and your role.
Well, thanks for the invitation to be here today, and you've lined up a great panel, so I'm happy to play a small part in it. As the Superintendent of Bankruptcy, I work at arm's length from the government, and I often describe the OSB's role simply. We help to make the rules of insolvency, and we help ensure everyone follows them. We license trustees, who are the only professionals that can file proceedings under the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act or under the Companies Creditors Arrangement Act, where they're referred to as monitors. And we oversee the system so it functions fairly and as intended. The majority of licensed insolvency trustees, who are also known as LITs or monitors, are really trusted professionals who act with integrity, and they can advise businesses and consumers on all their options, including, importantly, non-insolvency options. So one of my key messages is to encourage business owners to seek credible advice early on to maximize the range of solutions available. My office, the OSB, has numerous functions, and some really helpful tools. But today I'll just highlight the fact that we will investigate complaints and pursue criminal or civil enforcement against those involved in the system as appropriate. And importantly, the OSB doesn't promote insolvency as a first choice, but we're there to ensure it's a credible, well-functioning option when needed.
Okay. And maybe to kind of come at it from a very high level, why does Canada need an insolvency system, and how you fit into that? To put that in layman's terms, are there a lot of bad actors out there? Are there people that will try to scam you, so to speak, with good advice, but they're not actually, credible sources of advice?
Yeah. So really, when we talk about an insolvency system, we think of it as being a key pillar in a well-functioning, resilient economy. It's there, as you mentioned, to promote confidence by providing an orderly, predictable, and efficient process for everyone involved. And it actually supports entrepreneurship and investment. And in Canada, our framework is really designed to preserve value where possible, helping viable businesses restructure, maintain jobs, and protect important commercial relationships. And when recovery isn't feasible, there's an orderly liquidation process that releases assets back into the economy so then they can be put to more productive use. And ultimately, this is important, it allows the individuals involved to also be relieved of stress and challenges of dealing with a financially strained business. So the Office of the Superintendent of Bankruptcy, and the superintendent, in fact, has existed since 1932, and it is there to make sure that bad actors don't get away with things, that there are consequences. I would say it's rare, but you need us there to be the backstop to keep things in line.
Okay. And then another thing that the office does is effectively collects data and stats, because you kind of get the big picture of what's happening out there, in the market. If you read the press, which I'm a part of, you tend, I'll be frank, you kind of tend to get like a pretty gloomy picture. Meanwhile, I often say to people, most people don't realize that last year the economy still grew like 1.5%, which is pretty good considering, the trade war and, the talk of 51st state and all that stuff that kind of had us in a national conniption, as I like to say, last year. But I was wondering, with like real data on bankruptcies and filings and things of that sort, where do we stand right now? Because you hear more about even things on the personal side, like consumer delinquencies are up, credit card delinquencies, et cetera. How does it look for the Canadian business environment?
Yeah, so be a little bit wary of headlines for sure. And I will say my office does publish stats monthly, quarterly, and annually. So if anybody's interested, they can go look at them, including provincial breakdowns and forward sortation codes, which is sort of an abridged postal code. And the bottom line is that insolvency volumes did rise in 23 and 24 after what we would call a COVID pandemic dip. But the insolvency rate has actually remained relatively stable at around 1 per 1,000 businesses over about the last 10 years or so. And the context matters here, right? So raw numbers don't tell the full story, because if we have more businesses, then that raw data isn't sufficient to explain it. So the way I would frame it is insolvency isn't exploding. I would say it's responding as expected to broader economic conditions. And one important point is that actually many businesses exit the Canadian economy without filing an insolvency at all. And sometimes that might be okay. But the concern would be where there might be assets that wouldn't be returned to productive use, or employees that may not have recourse to the wage earner protection program. We would want to see those businesses file. And so then they should explore that option with an LIT, a licensed insolvency trustee.
Okay. And when we've been talking before, kind of figuring out themes of what your office sees and what might be most helpful to viewers of this, you kind of stress the importance of early intervention. Explain a little bit more about, from your point of view, what that means. And I'll put it like this: like, as a reporter, like, we tend to only see the cases that make it to effectively the worst case scenario, where it's like CCAA, where you have a full-blown court restructuring. It's a very formal process. So yeah, like if you are in a bit of financial trouble, what are the options and who can you reach out to?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really key message. Early action is critical. Business owners stay attuned to so many things in their strategic thinking, and I think they need to stay attuned to warning signs. And these can include, you mentioned, financial trouble, declining cash flow, tightening credit, supplier pressure, but even I would include governance struggles, anything that could erode creditor confidence. And then if you seek advice early, you have far more options. You can actually avoid a formal insolvency altogether by doing that. And when businesses wait too long, choices narrow and outcomes become far more disruptive for owners, employees, and suppliers. And from our perspective, the insolvency system really works best when it's used as a restructuring tool, not as a last resort, when you're really left with fewer options. And I would also, I don't know if we have any creditors watching today, but I would encourage them to take early action as well. Actually, many creditors have really good intelligence and data to enable them to detect when trouble is brewing. And this could actually allow them to start proactively working with businesses to find solutions. And there's a better outcome for all in that case as well. So by intervening early, you keep distress from becoming a crisis, really.
Okay. And then last thing for you is, I know you've had a bit of a mandate to modernize the system, for lack of a better term, or maybe that is the right term. Maybe just give a brief overview of what you've been doing, and what the office is doing, as we're kind of in these more challenging times.
Yeah, so I mean, first let me start with the fact that Canada's insolvency framework is actually really well regarded internationally. And one of the things that draws people here, and we're seeing some cross-border filings for this very reason, is sort of a level of flexibility and fairness and relatively low cost. The system has really benefited over the years from a level of what I'll call creativity, where solutions can be explored to address myriad situations. And that makes it fairly nimble. So it can respond and adapt to changing needs, situations, in different business contexts.
Okay.
As I said, my office is there to ensure the system continues to be fit for purpose, and that the benefits of the Canadian system are realized, but not pushed too far. So by this, I mean, we want to maintain that essential level of fairness and predictability. So what we're doing is we're working hard on the compliance front, and making sure that the rules are followed, that the rules are updated. So we have some legislative and regulatory work underway. And we're also using sort of narrow AI, I call it, to help us with detection tools. And that helps us get involved earlier, again, on the theme of early intervention. Same goes for my office. We want to get ahead of any non-compliance and address it. And so we're using all of the information and data that we gather and some narrow AI to kind of pick up on those themes and address it. So that goes back to the idea of complaints, that if something's gone wrong, people don't always think of complaining to my office. And I would encourage them to do so, because that enables us to sort of address it more quickly.
Okay. Perfect. Well, we've kind of hit our 10-minute mark, so appreciate the chat. And so we'll leave it there. And now we're gonna go to our panel, which is a wide range of experts on all of this stuff. And we're gonna basically take a broader look at business restructuring and pivots. And in this panel, we've got a broad mix of financial, legal, and business leaders. So first, we're going to introduce them. Not 100% sure what screen you see it, but I think you can see all their names. So I'll give just a really quick read of them. Jonathan Krieger from John Grant Thornton, Kelly Barassa from Blake's, Naveed Mansour from Fan Advisors, and Eugene Lee from Hudbay Minerals. So what we're probably going to start off doing, for those of you who may not be as familiar with this world, those titles may mean nothing, or you might be kind of confused. So I'll just get each panelist to kind of give a brief overview of what they do and how they kind of fit into the system. So Jonathan, maybe go first.
Thanks very much, Tim, and it's a pleasure being here. So I'm John Krieger. I'm the National Restructuring Leader at John Grant Thornton, which is a corporate and consumer insolvency firm with offices across Canada. So my team across the country works with banks, lawyers, and most importantly, clients in financial difficulty where we can add value and help them through difficult times.
Okay. Kelly?
Tim, I'm a partner at Blake Castles and Graydon, a national business law firm in Canada. I co-lead our national restructuring and insolvency practice, where we assist all parties affected by or involved with distressed or insolvent debtors, including the debtor companies, lenders, court officers like John and Naveed, who's here with us today, as well as prospective purchasers or investors as they navigate both formal insolvency and restructuring proceedings and out-of-court workouts.
All right. Naveed?
Well, thanks for having me here, Tim. Yeah, I'm a managing director at Fan Advisors. I'm based in Toronto, however, we do work across mandates all across Canada. While I've spent a large part of my career in the restructuring world, per se, but rather than advising from the outside as a consultant, I actually spend a lot of my time inside companies serving as part of their management team, either as interim CFO or chief restructuring officer or whatnot. Although I am a licensed bankruptcy trustee, and that's where I got my training, I do feel that in most cases, a formal insolvency process destroys values for stakeholders, especially for shareholders. So our view is that in many cases, a very good experienced management team can actually avoid a formal insolvency, and we enjoy becoming part of that team and leveraging our collective experience. So I'm really looking forward to discussing the practical sides of turnarounds, and especially getting some insight from Eugene, because I think he's lived through some of it.
All right, nice little perfect handoff. Eugene?
I am Eugene Lee. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for Hudbay. Hudbay is a diversified mid-tier copper company based in Canada. Today, Hudbay is Canada's largest Canadian headquartered, Canadian domiciled copper producer. And I've been with Hudbay for just over 13 years, the last 3 as a CFO. And prior to that, I was a mining investment banker for 12 years.
All right, perfect. So maybe we'll give a little bit of the lay of the land for those listening in, because there's a lot of, like I was saying earlier, I don't want to say misinformation, but confusion out there about where things really stand and what businesses are really thinking about and talking about. And so we've got some people inside businesses and also advising these businesses. So it'd be great to kind of get their takes. John, from what you hear from clients, what are the pressing issues today? And is it, do you believe and do you agree with the sense that like it is a challenging time for clients?
So Tim, thanks for asking that question. Society is going through one of the most significant changes it's experienced since the Industrial Revolution. While the Industrial Revolution impacted physical labor, AI is impacting cognitive work. But the issue is not technology or AI alone. There's geopolitical concerns, tariff issues, as you mentioned earlier. The issues around post-pandemic shopping, the way people buy and consume product after the pandemic, the way people go to work and where they go to work. All of these things are going to have a profound impact on businesses, and many industries are going to have watershed moments likely within the next 5 years.
Okay. And do you find that there have been more inbounds, basically, because businesses are confused or caught up in this what sounds like a revolution? And if so, what is the advice you give, or kind of, how might businesses start to even think about planning for and potentially restructuring for this new era?
Kevin, there's a few things. I think Elizabeth spoke about it earlier, and that is around the warning signs. So some warning signs are very easy to identify. Declining business operations, operational losses, loss of key customers, losing market share. Those are the easy things to identify and able to force a company into a pivot moment, whether it's through a formal process or an informal process. The bigger challenges are the warning signs that people can't quickly identify. Like I said, the technological impacts that may be coming down the road, or consumer preferences, or the impact of tariffs or geopolitical issues on the business going forward. So really, the view is you have to surround yourself with the right people to get advice on how to work through those challenges. One thing I would suggest is that, if you look at the executive team in a business, the executive team may only have part of the answers. Usually the strategic decisions are made through shared leadership. Shared leadership could be marketing, it could be the CFO office, accounting, it could be sales, it could be anybody that brings value to the equation at determining the right solution going forward. Okay.
And as someone who's in the news and just an avid reader of what's going on in the world, I guess I've realized over time that I'm almost overly attuned to how much things are changing because it's my job. I have to be in it. From your vantage point, do you find that businesses are aware of how much things are changing, or do you find that it's tough for businesses because maybe you're a public company and you're so focused on quarterly reporting that you're just, it's always kind of one foot in front of the other, and you can be missing kind of the big picture? What are you seeing? Are people aware of a general sense of a shift, but not really sure how to tackle it? Are people almost paralyzed by not knowing how to, or where to even start? What are you seeing day to day?
So a strategic pivot requires a number of things. One is it takes some bravery because you need to move forward and go down a path that you haven't gone down before. It takes risk because you're changing the way you've done things, and what you've done in the past does not necessarily work going forward. And it usually requires some financial and emotional investment from the management team. Not always are people willing to put that in and put the investment in that they're required in order to make this work. But I do believe that people are aware that there's some changes happening and they're going to have to make some strategic pivots very soon.
Okay. And maybe, Eugene, this might be the best time to kind of jump to you for a sec because you basically live this and you do a really good job of kind of summarizing the story. So maybe give a quick rundown of what Hudbay's gone through.
I think Jonathan hits a lot of interesting points that I'll try to cover in our story. So Hudbay is a 99-year-old business, old world mining, and had been a public company for over 20 years. But the company about 5 years ago was a bit stuck, operationally sound, but a bit over leveraged and really unable to improve its valuation, really realize its potential and unlock its growth pipeline. So to initiate that strategic pivot, I think first we needed to make a financial pivot. So when I was appointed CFO just over 3 years ago, I established what I call the 3P plan, the 3 prerequisites plan to unlock value in our growth project in Copper World. So that was our North Star. This is what we wanted to do as a company. We wanted to unlock this project, but we were constrained financially, strategically, and credibility wise. So working closely with the CFO, we cut discretionary spending, focused on free cash flow generation. So we only made investments that generated free cash flow within 3 years, and we cut sort of other spending. What that allowed us to do was establish financial targets, reasonable ones, that you could hit and build credibility and a track record of meeting those targets, which again takes time, quarter over quarter, results, period after period of financial results that met expectations, exceeded expectations to build valuation in the company and confidence in the company. The next step was a bolder one. It was to make an acquisition, an opportunistic acquisition. And this was the acquisition of our third mine. So increasing our platform, broadening our platform, diversifying risk, and that allowed us to build increasing resilience. This allowed us to reposition the company and pave the way for a transformative equity offering, which permanently allowed us to deleverage the company. So that we attacked this from both fronts, adding EBITDA in terms of that third asset to grow the company, and that enabled us to get the confidence in the market to do an equity offering to permanently leverage the balance sheet.
Okay. And maybe for those who don't know, talk a little bit about where the company is today. I mean, I know how your stock price has performed, but maybe give a quick overview, given that copper is the sexy asset these days.
Yeah, it was opportunistic, and sometimes luck plays a role in this. We added a copper mine in British Columbia, Copper Mountain, and obviously copper price has done very well. I think there were a lot of challenges at first. Getting all the stakeholders on side, internal first, because you had to really change sort of the way we were doing business and change that mindset. But as you delivered those results and people saw the credibility being established, that it sort of gained confidence. Communication to external stakeholders was key in this pivot, because you needed to establish internal buy-in, and then the external validation was sort of allowed you to continue this process internally. So 3 years later, proud to say that we've achieved all 3 elements of the 3P plan. We've had 24% growth and compounded annual growth in our EBITDA, reaching $1 billion of EBITDA in the calendar year 2025, and over $400 million of free cash flow. The balance sheet has been transformed from one of the highest levered companies to the lowest in the sector, and we've had consecutive share price performance of 60% and 134% over the last 2 years. Results are we've achieved a $10 billion market cap, the highest that we've had in our company's history. And frankly, the most important part is we built resilience in the company and the ability to reinvest not only in that Copper World growth project, that North Star, but actually have the capital to reinvest in generational investments in each of our existing three mines, so that they have longer life and increased throughput coming out of the decade.
All right, all right. Naveed, maybe we'll go to you now, because you often are brought into situations like this to essentially help the management team on the turnaround. And Eugene's got a bit of a unique background, I would argue, because came from iBanking, has a deep financial mindset, understands corporate development, things of that sort. If you're working with a smaller business, or maybe just a specific industry that's not a private company, is not used to kind of specific financial metrics. Was wondering, kind of, when you come in, what do you kind of lay the groundwork with, or how do you lay the groundwork, and what approaches do you kind of lay out for people?
Yeah, so obviously every business is different, right? And every management team is different. And every management team has a bunch of strengths, and they have some weaknesses. And the weaknesses usually aren't because they're not smart or they don't know what to do. It's a bit of inexperience, and they haven't navigated through these type of situations. So, as I say, look, the financial piece, the balance sheet portion of it is obviously extremely important. Managing your balance sheet, which means watching your debt, watching your current assets, current receivables, of course, is really important. But I always say the balance sheet, problems in the balance sheet is the end result of an underlying problem, which is usually something to do with your operations. Something has changed, and we need to fix it, or we need to pivot, as we've said so many times here, or we need to just relook at it. But you've got your day job. There's a lot of issues that you're dealing with, and as I call it, putting out fires. So the question becomes, what do you focus on? And I think some of these principles apply to every business. If you look at the balance sheet, I think you really have to be proactive. Leverage and debt is an important part of running a business. And so if you can be proactive and look at proactive refinancing, okay, banks will like you when you're credit worthy. They may not like you so much when you're not credit worthy. So try to refinance your debts that are due, that are upcoming in the next couple of years, before you run into issues, and so you can lock in favorable rates and extended maturities. Then there's aggressive receivables, right? A lot of people have paper profit, as I call it, but the money is all sitting in the accounts receivable. So the question is, well, how do we do better to collect our receivables? You can offer discounts, but a lot of times it's just more tactical than that. It's pick up the phone and chase your customers down and have that open communication with them. And then, a couple other points, and I think Eugene touched on some of them, is, either look at asset divestment. Okay. There are, usually most businesses, especially when they're heading into a downturn, there are non-core or underperforming assets. I would look at, sometimes they have real estate, unused equipment, there's slow moving inventory, try to get rid of it before, I call it, the vultures come out. And then on the operational side, I think a lot of companies have a lot of money tied up in inventory. Again, I'm assuming this is a product-based business. And so I think we really need to focus on rationalizing the product portfolios, spend your money, because it's limited now, on your top performing products or services, and really look at this as an opportunity to phase out lower margin or capital intensive offerings. I know and I get it. Everyone's scared of a recession and on all of that, and it does impact your business. But I really do think that recessions can offer a lot of opportunity and a lot of clarity, provided you have some clarity and focus. And if you can use this time to change your strategy and goals, I think you can actually come out much further ahead.
Okay. And maybe for the most practical question of all so far, in your case, when is it best for a company to reach out to you, and when is it too late? Because I think a lot of companies, I would assume a lot of companies think they can, either fix it themselves, or they might be in a stage of denial, and then it becomes too late. So from your vantage point, when is it best to get involved?
Well, everyone on this panel is going to tell you early intervention, early intervention. That goes without saying. I think when there is a shift either in the economy or a shift in something to do with your business, I think it's always nice to get a different perspective and get somebody in. And I always say it's not necessarily to change your business or do anything, but just get someone independent to come in, and I call it look under the hood. Just take a quick look under the hood and make sure everything is fine, because there's a storm coming. You need both hands on the steering wheel. You need to make sure your car is running well. And that's all it is. So the sooner you do it, the better. Some companies don't. Later on, we also get involved. It just causes more time, more money. And as much as, nobody likes to spend a bunch of money on professionals, the money you spend up front is probably a lot lower than when you spend it when you're really in trouble.
Gotcha. This may sound like a crazy analogy, but we were having a conversation at work one day about individual therapy, going to see a therapist. And a friend of mine who's very big on therapy was saying, everybody thinks that you should only go to a therapist once you've had a parent die or some really severe thing happens. And they're like, no, the best therapy for me comes from monthly check-ins that make me realize there's certain things circulating in my brain that I don't even realize are there, So at least to me sounds a little bit similar. Kelly, maybe best to go to you now. What might actually be helpful is for someone watching this, it might be hard, it might be easy to get lost in kind of how everybody here is similar or different in what they do. So maybe give a quick breakdown of kind of who you typically work for or with, and when you get involved in some sort of process.
There are three key groups, I'll call it, within insolvency proceedings, particularly formal proceedings. You obviously have the debtor company or the distressed company's senior secured lenders most often, and then the advisory group. And those three groups, you have both inside and outside of formal proceedings. So at Blake's, we have a pretty even split between those three groupings. I find it changes perhaps over time, or perhaps what office we're working in at any given time, as to whether you're doing more advisory work, more lender work, or more debtor work. But we get involved with all three, and you have to put a slightly different hat on each time because you're dealing with different people. Tim, I liked your therapy analogy, because particularly representing distressed companies, and Eugene, I think, would know this firsthand, you're not necessarily in the same position that you would expect to be as a senior executive of a successful business. All of a sudden, you're dealing with challenges and people that you might not be used to dealing with. And those people, particularly the lenders and the advisors, all have their own lingo and their own relationships. And it can seem a little overwhelming, to be sure. Obviously, the comment has been made, I think, by at least three of the four speakers so far today. Seeking advice and assistance earlier is always going to be better. And it may be that you seek advice and find out you don't actually need anything right then, but you at least know what the options are and what you may need to be thinking about.
Right. And actually, what might be helpful, forgive me if this is ultra basic, but I was thinking, there might be some small business, founders or entrepreneurs listening in who aren't the most financially savvy, who, have been hearing a bunch of these terms and are like, honestly, even this is over my head. So to break it down a little bit, when you hear Kelly talk about a senior secured lender and who these different groups are, this is my interpretation of it all, having covered these things, but basically you tend to have a company, you tend to have someone who's lent you money, often a bank. And if they're secured, it just means that they, like, if things go bad, they have the right to go after your assets, basically. Forgive me if I'm butchering this explanation, but that's how I always kind of make sense of it in my brain. And then you have advisors who are brought in, and you can also have unsecured creditors, who are maybe people who lend you money, but they rank lower on the totem pole, so to speak. So if there is some sort of restructuring, the senior secured creditors, or the bank and somebody who's claim against your assets, they get repaid first. So they have first dibs on what's in the company. Kelly, one of the things I think people are unsure of what to do with, and you mentioned this a bit before to me, that effectively you get a letter from your bank. I'm just using bank here as an example. Maybe you're offside on some covenants, or maybe the bank's even reaching out proactively ahead of time. From what I know, and what I have from covering stuff, that it's really easy to kind of ignore those letters, or want to ignore those letters, or be denial is such a strong term, but it's hard to mentally accept that things are going offside. So it actually might be helpful as someone who kind of is an expert in this. What does that process actually look like? You start getting these letters or notices. What do you do? What should you do? And should you be as scared as you might feel?
So I think your explanation is quite good, and particularly in Canada, in our, call it, mid-market economy, most businesses will have some kind of bank debt, which is typically secured, meaning that the bank has taken some kind of security agreement from the company, typically securing their debt against all of the assets, which means they are a principal stakeholder in the business. Yes, your shareholders are important stakeholders, but if the company is in any scenario where they may be nearing some kind of credit inflection point, you need to be having regard to your senior lender. And you started mentioning letters, and I've got to tell you, being proactive is very important here. Banks don't like writing those letters. By the time they're writing those letters, they may have an opinion of the business that is not necessarily what the business intends to convey. So for business leaders who are listening in, if you are coming up on either a maturity under your credit, if you are coming up on some kind of anticipated default, if you need some kind of accommodations to your credit, obviously speak with expert advisors, but reach out and open the dialogue with your senior lender before they start reaching out to you. That alone is going to set you on a better footing. And what you may find is, depending on what the situation is and the gravity of the situation, or the financial institution you're dealing with, you may all of a sudden not be dealing with the relationship bankers who you have exactly that, a relationship with. The bankers who you have dealt with throughout your lending relationship may either be moved to the side and still have some involvement, but not principal involvement, or they may be removed altogether and your file may be transitioned to a workout group within the bank. Those are sometimes called workout, they're sometimes called special loans. What you will find is you're now dealing with a group of people who have, at their core, a different role within the bank. Obviously, your relationship bankers are in the business of lending money. Special loans bankers are in the business of ensuring that that money is recoverable by the bank. And so they have a whole suite of checklists and systems that they bring into play right away. So they don't have the relationship. They don't know you personally. They haven't dealt with you for years. And so they're looking at your business, they're looking at your financials, and they're going to be very focused on numbers, and you need to give them the story behind the numbers to show them why your business is viable, why your business is a business that they should give some time to. There is a good chance they're going to engage a financial advisor. So it'll be someone either like John or like Naveed, who will come in and look at your financials, look at your strategic plan, and give a report to the bank. So they're call it an independent third party. I've heard lots of businesses say, but we've already provided this information to the bank. It's just an added level of comfort for the bank. Financial advisors, and I'm sure John and Naveed can speak to this, they don't go in looking to uncover problems. They go in looking for solutions, and they are good to align themselves with. Sure, they may have been engaged by your lender, but you shouldn't see them as on the other side. One of the things that I personally like most about restructuring work is the collaborative nature of it, because at the end of the day, we all want the same thing. We want a success. We want an exit. We want a restructuring. From a business perspective, you don't want to be dealing with the special loans bankers anymore. From the bank perspective, they want to know that their loan is in good standing and that they can continue to lend money to you, or that someone else is going to come in and do that. And from the advisors, both legal and financial, we get a real high off of success. Like we have those in our book of our successes. We don't count the successes as the businesses that fall apart and have to be liquidated. Frankly, that's not fun for us. So we're all looking to come out with a success, and you need to be aware of that.
Okay. And then maybe building off that, John and Naveed, maybe John, I'll start with you. I can't remember who had mentioned this at one point before, but do you find that people are weary of you? Like, is there a fear of bringing somebody else in, and it's almost like admitting failure from a business's perspective? Wondering on kind of what you try to tell businesses and what they can reasonably expect kind of out of this situation, because I think also too, a lot of people don't even know how the process works. Like they might assume that once an advisor's been brought in, it's like we're about to go through a court process or something along those lines. So how do you typically navigate those first few meetings and approaches?
So, Tim, I agree entirely with what Kelly is saying, in that, I think there's a misconception that the introduction of a financial advisor into a difficult situation automatically means that there's going to be some type of a formal court process or some sort of a liquidation. That's not correct. In fact, most of the files that I work on do not end in a court process or a formal process. Most of the projects that I work on will be ones where we will be introduced to a company, will provide some value-added solutions, will provide a view from the 20,000-foot level, because we're not in the trenches as the business owners are, and we could provide some value that they may be able to utilize to actually create a pivot going forward. So I agree with Kelly. I also agree with the comment that it's entirely critical that somebody get involved earlier in the process. I think Elizabeth said at the beginning that the longer time goes by, financial challenges generally don't improve. So as time goes by, you lose your opportunity for liquidity, your relationship with your lender sometimes deteriorates, and you lose your opportunity to refinance if that's an option. So I do agree that there's a lot of solutions that are available, even if a company receives a letter from a bank that it needs some additional information or it has some concerns with their performance.
Right. And Naveed, one thing you had mentioned in the past is, I think it was like, to your mind, it almost, people don't realize that like bringing in fresh blood or advisors or et cetera can actually help build or rebuild credibility with the banks or the lenders or whomever. So how do you kind of see your role, and what do you kind of counsel clients in those first few meetings or approaches?
Yeah, so well, we rarely actually act for the banks. Okay, we don't actually act for the banks. We try not to. I really think that I want to build a practice that is debtor focused. So we're really trying to help the companies. And in some cases, again, it's gently pushing back on certain things that happen, right? Because as Kelly said, when files go to special loans, the special loans personnel, their objective is very, very different than the business relationship person who actually gave you the money. And a lot of owners make a mistake thinking, oh, I've got a great relationship with the business relationship person, so I'm just going to go to them, and they're going to either give me more money or they're going to give us a pass. And in fact, it's the opposite that happens, because the banks and lenders are smart too. That's why they have a special loans, because they want to take the bias and they want to take the relationship out of there and focus, as Kelly said, on the facts, the numbers and stuff. So what we do is, and a lot of times, again, and it's shocking, but not so much anymore. A lot of times companies think, they've had a bad quarter, they've had, a bad 6 months, and their reaction is, okay, well, if we delay releasing the information to the bank, somehow they're either going to forget or it's going to go away. And in fact, the opposite happens. They get their backup because they're like, oh, that's a red check mark, because why isn't the company submitting its financial statements on time? Now, the conundrum is, because the companies are facing all these challenges, and the CFO, and Eugene, maybe you can speak about it, but the CFO in particular, or the accounting department, is so overwhelmed putting out fires, dealing with suppliers, dealing with all of these issues, that they actually don't have time to work on the financials. And so then what happens is, what we've done, and we hope we do it effectively, is we actually act as the bridge between the lender and the company. Because a lot of times I've had so many conversations with my lender to say, look, this is not a bad company. They're not trying to do anything fraudulent. They're not trying to do anything. They're just stuck. And on the flip side, we have to push back at the companies and say, guys, the worst thing you can do right now is to not release information, or try to think that if you don't give them the information, they're just going to go away. So again, but it's working as a team. And as I said earlier, every company has its own strengths, its own weaknesses. And so what we try to do is we try to just fit in. And a lot of it is there is strategy and there's all of that stuff, but a lot of it is just getting the work done. And I'm always, my gut tells me, especially small businesses, the entrepreneur knows. The entrepreneur, the owner of the business, knows what's going on. They know, they either don't have the resources, they don't have the people, they don't, I would say, who's their right-hand person? They don't have the right-hand person. And so as a result, it goes into a spiral. But if you go into them and say, okay, well, what do you think needs to be done? How can I help? And change it from an advisory to, we're actually just trying to help you as part of the management team, I think that's when we get success. But the company also has to be open to that. Because, right, to the point that was raised, if they view us as, well, we're just, here for the bank, or and we have this all the time, Jonathan, Kelly, I'm sure, they say, well, you deal with the banks all the time, so, you're going to take their side, or, you're probably, even though you're working for us, you're probably looking after the bank's interest more. It doesn't work that way. We and especially, for us, we make sure we try to be engaged only by the company, because we understand our obligation, and if we can help you out, it's a great win. As Jonathan said, the success is avoiding insolvency, not putting it into insolvency. Now, sometimes it's a tool. Sometimes you need to use it as a tool. So it's okay. But then if you use it as a tool, the more organized you are, the cheaper you can get in and out. So there's all these considerations. So you need, and this is new to a lot of people. So what you need trusted advisors that you can work with and that would listen to you.
Okay. And Eugene, as someone who's actually gone through this, but I want to make clear, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Hudbay never actually broke a covenant. So in other words, it was never severely offside with its lender. It was a bit of a, people forget now, but during what I often refer to as like the ESG era, miners' stock prices really got hammered. There's lots of concerns about, after the commodity super cycle crashed, debt on miners of all sorts balance sheets became the thing that investors hated the most. So some of it was kind of bad market timing or bad market negativity is the best way to put it. But still, you had to navigate a turnaround. And I've long been fascinated with, you can see a stock price screaming red because it's down 50% or whatever the case may be. And yet you listen to kind of quarterly conference calls and management still is putting on a brave face. So having lived through it very briefly, how did you how did the team kind of navigate the 5 steps of whatever the therapy phrase is? It's just like denial, acceptance, yeah, just wondering kind of how what was kind of the breaking point that made things actually kind of get moving.
It's funny that Kelly and Naveed talk about the smaller businesses and medium-sized businesses, and we have a larger business, and a lot of the symptoms and a lot of the policies that you have to go through are actually very similar. You have to be proactive, so you need to keep the banks on side. You need to proactively keep the banks on side. Canadian banks and most of it are experts in our industries and are able to lend our industries, but you got to keep them informed and keep them on side. And if you see something ahead in your business, share the information with them and maybe tweak a covenant or two as you see prices may weak. Don't ask for forgiveness after you've breached a covenant. Go ahead and ask for covenant relief prior to it so that you have breathing room to operate. And I think that's important. That I think is consistent with Kelly and Naveed's comments. Don't wait till it's in the workout group. And I think it's important, particularly in cyclical industries where you're not in control of prices like we are, and so to have the freedom to be able to do that. I think the other part is to be prudent. I mean, don't plan for the best case scenario, plan for a reasonable case, and also for the worst case scenario. Ensure that you can bring in equity at the right level, and that applies to all businesses. It may seem dilutive at first, but the worst part is to end up on the other end of things and be over leveraged and in these programs. So I think prior planning is great. Bring in equity, improve your valuations as much as you can by communicating performance, and then you can deliver real growth, because a bank can be a partner, but a real partner is an equity partner.
Okay. Not sure who this would be best for, because a few of you kind of riffed on this in some capacity. Maybe Kelly, I'll throw to you first, and then anybody else can jump in. But there's a bit of I would argue, kind of a narrative out there that once you filed for CCAA, this is worst case scenario. For CCAA is like formal creditor protection. It's tend to be the cases that make the media, because at this point the court appoints a monitor that basically kind of takes control of the business in a way, and figures out independently what's really left for shareholders and for all different lenders and things of that sort. Is there I guess the best way to put it is there life after the worst case scenario? I think a lot of people think that this is like the end of my company, and so that's why people kind of try to avoid this stuff. So I'll leave it there. What do you think about that remark?
Yeah, that one's tough. Obviously, CCAA proceedings can be successful, but it's a question of how you define success. I think some of the most successful files that I have been involved in have been ones that maybe have gone into a court process, but not into CCAA. So I've done quite a few files where a company has been able to do a restructuring of their debt, get out from being over-levered through a corporate arrangement proceeding, which is a very flexible tool and very helpful. From a CCAA perspective, yes, there can be success. There are very few of those successes, though, that result in a return of shareholder value, just to be very clear on that. But how we gauge success would be, is there a going concern business? Are employees and other stakeholders still kept whole? And there are a lot of those files and a lot of very good stories where a company can continue for many, many years after a CCAA. It's just they're under a different ownership group and sometimes under different leadership.
Okay. And yeah, maybe using CCAA there was not the best example because that is a pretty stringent process. But I guess maybe the better thing to say, like, involving the courts or even just involving like experienced financial advisors. Like one of my big takeaways from it all is that it does not mean it's the end. If anything, it can actually be the beginning of something better. I sound like I'm a PR rep for the industry now, but do you think that there's a maybe John, like, is there a lack of awareness of that the acceptance is actually a first step in a way, and hiring experts is a first step to actually turning things around rather than just managing to the end?
Tim, so Naveed had mentioned earlier that, it's a tool. So there's a number of different restructuring statutes that can be used to turn your operations around and make a deal with your creditors. That's through a formal process. As I said, a lot of the work is done informally where you don't go into a formal process. There's a social stigma associated with a filing where people will think it's changed the business. People will look at me differently. I actually believe over the course of the last 10 years, the social stigma associated with CCAA, or the equivalent, which is a proposal under the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act, has fallen away. I think it's seen as a tool where that is really the last resort, where somebody has to go to a formal process, but it's a tool that allows them to turn their business around going forward. And there's a lot of successful restructurings that take place. As Kelly said, a lot of the times it's a bit of a different ownership structure that may be in place afterwards, but it at least allows a business to continue on going forward, retain employees, keep their creditors either whole or put their creditors with some type of recovery going forward, and keep the business moving in an industry that has some value.
All right. We'll have to wrap it up there because I saw the time and we've only got about a minute left. So on behalf of the Globe, I'd like to thank Jonathan, Eugene, Naveed, and Kelly for joining us today and sharing all of their thoughts. I'd also like to thank all of the virtual audience for tuning in. We're going to send everyone who registered for the event a link to the webcast recording in about 1 week, I think it is. And then also lastly, you're going to see a QR code on your screen, which links to a brief survey. Please take a minute to fill that out, and that way we can continue to improve our events. So thank you again to everyone, and enjoy your day.
Thanks, Tim.